Welcome back to The Deep Dive, where we take complex global topics, rip apart the source material, and hand you the synthesized knowledge you need. And if you are feeling, as we are, that the entire world is currently running on geopolitical and economic software that is, well, let's just say it's bloated, brittle, and prone to crashing, then you are exactly where you need to be today.
Today, we are diving deep into what is, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, arguably the most radical proposal for institutional reform of the 21st century. Our sources, which are rooted very deeply in high-level geopolitical strategy, they argue that the world needs a complete system replacement, not just another policy patch. They propose the formation of a C5 governing council, consisting of, well, the United States, China, India, Russia, and Japan.
That is a lineup that is absolutely designed to raise eyebrows. I mean, you're mixing deep rivals with old allies. It's a fascinating combination. Our mission today is to really take apart the central thesis behind this idea. And the argument is stark. It's almost dismissive of current diplomacy. It says the world doesn't need more photo opportunities, it doesn't need more high-level speeches or bigger summits. It needs systems.
That's the word, systems.
This is the current architecture, the UN, the WTO, the G7 is, in the source's pretty harsh words, failing. Or in some cases, already structurally incapable of managing global risks. So this five-nation group is proposed not as an alliance, but as, and I love this phrase, the potential world's new operating system.
And that's the best way to think about it. If global governance were a computer, we are all running on legacy code. It's like a 1990s operating system trying and failing to handle the computational demands of the 2020s.
It lags, it freezes.
It freezes, security holes are everywhere. So the C5 framework is proposed as the necessary reboot to install a functional, modern OS, one that's designed specifically for what is now a genuinely multipolar reality. It's about creating durable, boring, functional infrastructure where the world previously relied on high-stakes annual spectacle.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the foundational diagnosis here is the most crucial part. When we look at global disorder, whether it's, trade fragmentation, supply chain risk, escalating regional tensions, the media narrative almost always assumes it's a zero-sum power struggle. Usually it's framed as Washington versus Beijing. Right?
Always.
But our source material fundamentally challenges that diagnosis. They argue the disorder is often misdiagnosed as a power struggle, when it is, at its core, a coordination failure. What does that distinction even imply?
That is the absolutely critical insight of the whole thing. A power struggle implies that if one side just won, if one side won decisively, the system would stabilize. But the sources argue that even if the U.S. completely defeated China in a rivalry or, vice versa, the coordination problem would persist. It wouldn't go away.
Why not?
Because no single nation, not even the most powerful one, has the resources, the legitimacy, or frankly, the structural incentive to underwrite every single global system simultaneously anymore. The math just doesn't work.
So the U.S. can't afford the full costs of being the sole global guarantor.
It can't. And China, for its part, can't simply step into that role. I mean, for one, it has deep-seated multilateral legitimacy issues, and its focus is really on regional, not global, hegemony. And maybe most crucially, the other major powers, India, Russia, Japan, they're just not going to subordinate themselves to any single patron. That era is over.
So the global system is suffering from a vacuum of shared management. Is that the idea?
Precisely. You have 5 deeply consequential states, the proposed C5, whose unilateral actions in finance, in technology, in military, in energy, their decisions determine global outcomes for everyone else. The missing piece isn't dominance. It's the stable, predictable mechanism for these 5 states to coordinate on critical technical standards and manage friction. And here's the key part. Doing it without demanding ideological conformity or total trust.
Which is impossible anyway.
Completely impossible. So the C5 is proposed as that mechanism, a structural stabilizer for the 21st century.
Okay, so before we get into the nuts and bolts of the C5, we really have to spend a moment on the corpse of the old system. You can't really understand why a reboot is so necessary unless you accept that the current operating system has expired.
That's right. And for that, we need a really quick historical review to understand how global power was configured and, more importantly, why those configurations broke down. We basically have 2 distinct eras since 1945. The first was, of course, the bipolar Cold War era. That runs from about 1945 to 1991. Power was defined by the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was mostly fought through proxies, economic competition, that kind of thing.
And the sources highlight a critical and I think often forgotten point about this period. The institutions we inherited, the ones we still talk about today, were really only designed for one half of this binary world.
Absolutely. The structures we still lean on, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, which was the precursor to the WTO, they were never designed for universal global governance. That's a myth.
They were partisan tools, in a way.
They were explicitly created to foster Western capitalist economic stability. The goal was to prevent a repeat of the 1930s Great Depression and provide a stable financial system for the free world to compete against the Soviet bloc. So yes, they were mechanisms built for Western success in a binary conflict.
Then, of course, the Soviet Union dissolves in 1991, and we enter what everyone calls the unipolar moment. That period arguably lasted until the financial crisis in 2008. This was the era of just undeniable U.S. primacy.
Undeniable dominance. The U.S. was the sole, uncontested superpower. It was dominant in every single domain. Military, obviously, but also culturally, financially, and technologically. The entire world kind of settled into the belief that the rules-based order, which was underwritten by American power and guided by Western liberal democracy, was the permanent state of global affairs.
The end of history argument.
Exactly. It was a period of immense optimism, maybe in retrospect, far too much optimism about globalization and the idea that everyone would eventually converge to the same model.
But the sources are very clear in detailing the forces that began chipping away at the structure long before the current crises really flared up. It wasn't one single event, was it? It was more of a cumulative effect that started in the early 2000s.
It was a structural collapse, and that's why it's so hard to reverse. The cracks were both internal and external. Externally, the biggest factor was China's absolutely breathtaking economic surge after it joined the WTO in 2001. It just fundamentally transformed global supply chains, manufacturing, and wealth creation at a speed the world had literally never witnessed before.
And at the same time, you have Russia reemerging.
Simultaneously, Russia, under new leadership, began its political and economic revival. It started reasserting itself as a decisive military and energy actor in Eurasia, and it very pointedly rejected the notion of permanent Western dominance.
And you can't forget India.
And India, too, was rising rapidly. It was ascending as this technology and services powerhouse, leveraging its massive talent pool and, of course, its demographic scale.
And while all of this external redistribution of power was happening, the U.S. itself was dealing with a kind of internal erosion.
Precisely. The global backlash to the prolonged Iraq War deeply, deeply damaged American credibility, and it exhausted its political capital. But the real nail in the coffin, the sources argue, was the 2008 global financial crisis.
Why that specifically?
Because that crisis originated in the absolute heart of the Western financial system, it wasn't an external shock. And so it severely damaged global faith in the Western economic models and governance structures that underpin the entire global system.
The logic being, if the system's own anchor could nearly collapse due to reckless internal governance,
then why should emerging economies still subordinate their policy choices to it? That loss of faith was profound, and it created a huge opening for alternative models to gain traction.
so that cocktail of U.S. domestic fatigue and this external power redistribution fundamentally ended the unipolar moment. And the consequences are, well, they're everywhere you look in the resulting institutional decay.
Absolutely everywhere. The pillars of liberal multilateralism, consensus governance, collective security, free trade, are visibly failing. Our sources offer some really harsh assessments of the current status quo.
Like the UN Security Council.
The UN Security Council, for example, is described as entirely frozen in time. Its structure reflects the military victors of 1945, the P5, not the economic and demographic architects of the 21st century.
And what's the tangible cost of that paralysis? I mean, it's not just debate, it's actual inaction, right?
The cost is total gridlock on existential issues. Any serious discussion of reform like, say, adding India or Japan or Germany as permanent members is continuously blocked by the existing members who are just protecting their veto power.
So what happens?
This structural inertia means that when the world desperately needs a collective security response to a major crisis, the UN is often rendered completely irrelevant. It's forced to just watch conflicts unfold from the sidelines.
And then globally, the system that was supposed to manage the economy, the World Trade Organization, is facing its own existential paralysis. I want to spend a moment here because this is a core problem the C5 is supposed to solve. How do the sources describe the state of the WTO?
They state it very bluntly. The WTO's system for ensuring compliance and resolving disputes, it's called the appellate body, is effectively paralyzed. And that is a huge, if technical point for our listeners to understand.
Explain that. What is the appellate body?
It's essentially the Supreme Court of global trade. It was the final word. But its appointments have been blocked primarily by the U.S., which has argued for years that its judges were overreaching and improperly imposing obligations on member states.
So with no judges, there's no court.
Exactly. The result is that there is no final arbiter in global trade disputes.
So without a functioning Supreme Court of Trade, what happens when two nations violate the rules?
Chaos. I mean, they can start the dispute process, but it just hits a wall. There is no final binding enforcement mechanism. And that means trade rules become essentially voluntary, which encourages nations to engage in protectionism, industrial subsidies, and punitive measures without any fear of international legal consequence.
The whole system is running on a wing and a prayer.
And it's leading to massive fragmentation.
And the old power centers aren't faring much better. The source material explicitly calls the G7 a relic.
It is a relic. It's a relic of a unipolar moment that no longer exists. It's a club of wealthy allies. They share deep history, but strategically, it's just too narrow.
And the big omissions are obvious.
They're glaring. It crucially excludes China and India, the two largest contributors to global growth over the past 2 decades. As the sources point out, how can you possibly have a serious discussion about global economic stability without the world's largest industrial producer, China, and the fastest-growing major consumer market, India, at the core of the discussion?
It's an incomplete conversation.
Geopolitically, it's homogenous and strategically limited.
So the G20 was supposed to fix that. It was supposed to fix the G7's exclusivity. It included everyone important. But the sources, they deem it unwieldy.
It's functionally too large. It's a great idea in theory. But 20 voices mean 20 different political systems, 20 sets of domestic compulsions, and most importantly, 20 potential vetoes.
So it's good for statements, not for action.
The sources say the G20 is excellent for issuing joint statements about shared problems, but it's terrible for driving decisive, granular coordination on technical standards. It's too large for deep regulatory coordination, but it's too small for universal legitimacy. So the system is just structurally gridlocked at every level. The security level with the UN and the economic level with the WTO and the G20.
This gridlock brings us to the common proposed fix that the sources immediately reject. This mirage of a G2 world. A simple duopoly between the US and China. Why did the sources conclude this idea failed so badly?
It failed because it just fundamentally misreads the current geopolitical architecture. First, the sources emphasize that middle and smaller nations absolutely refuse to be squeezed into loyalty camps. That's not the world we live in anymore.
Right.
The world has moved past the Cold War dynamic where nations were forced to choose a patron. In a multipolar world, nations have built incredibly complex economic and military relationships, and they fiercely demand strategic autonomy.
Want agency, not obedience.
Precisely. Trying to force these client-state dynamics reminiscent of the Cold War, it just produces deep resentment and resistance. But second, and this is more critical, the core strategic danger of a G2 approach is bifurcation.
Splitting the world in two.
Splitting the world into two permanent, antagonistic economic and technological blocs. And our sources warn that this wouldn't just be Cold War 2.0. It would be dangerously faster. It would be infinitely more unstable because of pervasive cyber warfare, the speed of AI development, and the deep economic interdependence that already exists.
You can't just neatly cut it in half.
You can't. And the C5 proposal is explicitly designed to prevent this bifurcation by formalizing a shared table among competitors, forcing them into at least a minimum level of coordination.
So the diagnosis is structural failure, and the G2 option is deemed too dangerous. The source material argues the answer is the C5. The United States, China, India, Russia, and Japan. I have to push back on this because it seems deliberately provocative. Putting geopolitical rivals, Japan and Russia, the US and China at the core of the system, that seems like a recipe for institutionalizing the very gridlock you just described. Why these 5 specifically, and why on earth do the sources believe this configuration will reduce conflict?
That's an excellent challenge because it gets right to the heart of the source material's entire argument. They stress this repeatedly. The selection of the C5 is based on arithmetic, not ideology.
Okay, what does that mean, arithmetic?
It means this is not a club of shared values. It's not a new NATO. It is a council of shared necessity, and it's defined by current, undeniable global power realities.
This is about raw capability.
It's about raw capability. The sources argue that ignoring these five states' ability to unilaterally destabilize the entire system is the true source of gridlock. If you institutionalize their power, if you bring them inside the tent, you institutionalize a framework for managing their inevitable friction.
So the question is, who can break the system? And that's who's at the table.
Functionally, yes. They are the countries whose decisions, regardless of their political system, unilaterally determine outcomes for everyone else. And if you look at the collective power statistics of the C5, the scale is just massive.
Give me some numbers.
They account for a vast majority of global GDP based on purchasing power parity, or PPP. They control most of the world's industrial output. They house the largest ecosystems for AI, for semiconductors, for energy, and of course they possess the bulk of global military capability, including almost all the nuclear capacity.
So they're the systemically important nations.
They are, quite simply, the core structural stabilizer the world requires. Because if they don't coordinate, the system fails. It's that simple.
Okay, so let's break down the functional role the sources assign to each of the five members, because the dynamic between them is obviously key here.
We can define each role structurally based on their unique contributions to global stability and global risk.
Let's start with the U.S.
The United States is still, without question, the world's largest military power. It's the financial anchor for global capital markets, and it remains the engine of high-end innovation, particularly in cutting-edge technology.
Okay.
China brings the world's largest industrial base, overwhelming global production capacity. It's the indispensable manufacturing hub, and it remains the second largest global economy.
India is the next one.
And India is the fastest growing major economy on the planet. It's a demographic superpower, and it's increasingly defining the future of digital services, intellectual talent, and the huge consumer markets in the global south.
And now for the two strategically, let's say, difficult partners in this group, Russia and Japan.
Right. Russia remains a decisive military and energy actor. It controls vast resources, it defines the security dynamics across all of Eurasia, and it acts as a very vocal advocate for multipolarity and sovereign equality, pushing back against Western norms. Its inclusion forces the C5 to address security dynamics holistically, not just from a Western perspective.
And Japan. Why Japan over, say, Germany or the UK?
That's a question the sources address directly. Japan is chosen because it serves as a vital technological, financial, and institutional stabilizer. It's a major capital provider, it's a leading industrial democracy, and it brings a deep, stable, consensus-driven institutional memory to the table that is unique. It acts as a kind of structural ballast.
So the synthesis here is the critical component. This group reflects power as it actually exists today, not as we might wish to be ideologically.
It's an effort to institutionalize dialogue among the actual competitors, the ones who can actually break the system if they operate outside the framework.
So the logic is rivalry is inevitable.
Rivalry is inevitable, but a rivalry without structure, without guardrails, quickly descends into chaos. The C5 institutionalizes a structure for that rivalry. It offers clear rules for managing technical friction, and it creates channels for immediate crisis de-escalation.
Like a load-bearing beam.
The sources see it as a load-bearing beam in a rapidly shifting global building. It's structural, not decorative. And the viability of this entire structure, in their view, hinges completely on how they integrate the third largest economy at the table, India.
The sources treat India not just as a member, but as a crucial design feature for the whole C5 concept. They spend a significant amount of time addressing India's foreign policy approach, which they frame as the ultimate proof of the failure of camp thinking.
They make a very strong argument that the geopolitical logic of the 20th century, clear ideological divides, a dominant patron, loyal clients, and forcible discipline, that logic is completely dead.
It's a historical artifact.
It is. And trying to force that two-camp binary logic today is like trying to compress structural multipolarity into a bipolar framework. It just doesn't fit. It breaks.
Because the major players are too internally complex now. Is that the idea?
Exactly. They're too large, too complex, and their economic, military, and technological ties are way too deep and messy to be categorized as simple satellites or clients. I mean, just think about the modern reality. Economic ties crisscross ideological lines constantly.
Sure.
Technology ecosystems require global inputs. Energy flows completely ignore political narratives. So trying to force this complex world back into two neat ideological camps, it just produces friction everywhere.
You get trade wars that boomerang.
Get sanctions that create massive spillovers, and you see traditional alliances that fracture under the weight of their own inherent economic contradictions. And India's refusal to join either camp exposes this failure most clearly.
Okay, so let's clarify the distinction India draws between neutrality and strategic autonomy.
Yeah.
This is an important conceptual leap that the sources make.
It is absolutely crucial because the two are often confused. India's position is often mislabeled, especially by Western commentators, as passive neutrality or, indecisive fence-sitting. But the sources define strategic autonomy as active multi-vector statecraft. And they argue it's the future of major power foreign policy. India isn't avoiding power. It is actively diversifying its management of power to maximize its own sovereignty and national interests.
And what does that active management actually look like on the ground?
Well, it means engaging the U.S. intensely on high-end technology, on defense procurement, on diplomatic alignment on issues like the Quad,
All at the same time.
while simultaneously maintaining deep, long-standing defense legacy systems and critical energy ties with Russia. It means having an expansive economic relationship with China while fiercely and strategically contesting its border and its regional aspirations. And it means partnering extensively with Japan and others on infrastructure and finance.
It sounds exhausting.
It is an exhausting balancing act, but it preserves New Delhi's freedom of action.
And this exhausting approach, the sources argue, is an asset for the C5.
It is the key structural asset. India's refusal to join camps is not a problem for the C5, it is a design principle. It forces the C5 to be practical and structurally multipolar. It prevents the Council from being hijacked and turning into just another ideological club or a mere adjunct to the U.S.-China rivalry.
It forces pragmatism.
It compels the system to embrace coordination under conditions of profound difference. If the C5 requires its members to align perfectly before they can act, it will fail, just like the G20. India's presence mandates practical, functional cooperation.
And we see that pragmatic complexity reflected vividly in the Russia-India relationship, which the sources highlight as an operational example of multipolarity working outside the old Western structures.
That's a perfect case study. The relationship between Russia and India is defined by the sources as interacting as functional equals, not as a patron and a client.
There's no missionary tone.
None. There's no demand for full alignment on UN votes, just mutually beneficial engagement on specific strategic goods like defense systems and energy. And that deep issue-specific engagement produces incredible resilience and showcases why attempts by external parties to isolate or coerce either nation often fall short.
So, the C5 framework must be explicitly designed to treat such robust, non-aligned relationships as features, not bugs.
Precisely. The system has to accept that peers will interpret sovereignty differently. They will run vastly different economic models, and they will still need to coordinate on shared technical risks like AI safety or supply chain resilience. The source material offers a really powerful conclusion on this point. Traditional political camps create wars by hardening identities and demanding loyalty tests. Robust functional systems, like the C5 is intended to be, they absorb friction and channel conflict, creating off-ramps before they become strategic cliff edges.
So we know the why, the structural breakdown. We know the who, the C5 arithmetic. And we know the philosophical ground rules, strategic autonomy. Now we have to move to the how. The C5 has to operate fundamentally differently from the G7 or the G20. The sources call this failure model the summit trap.
The summit trap is the fatal flaw in today's global coordination efforts. A summit is the tip of the iceberg. It's a high-profile, media-driven event, usually lasts 2 or 3 days, and leaders meet primarily for photo opportunities and to announce solutions to problems that have already been allowed to fester for months or even years.
And then the motorcades leave.
The motorcades leave, and the problems immediately persist, because the real complex technical work isn't done at the top. It can't be.
The sources emphasize that real governance happens below the waterline. What does that mean?
It means it happens deep within the regulatory trenches. Real governance occurs in the ministries, in the standards bodies, the technical committees, and in the quiet negotiations between career civil servants.
It's about building bureaucratic muscle memory.
That's the phrase they use. Bureaucratic muscle memory. Shared data platforms, standardizing risk assessments, establishing technical protocols that survive shifts in political leadership. The analogy they often use is the European Union.
How so?
Its lasting power didn't come from inspirational leader speeches. It came from thousands of working groups and years of process discipline, creating alignment on the most arcane standards, like the size of olive oil cans or shared banking regulations. If the C5 wants to matter, it has to emulate that relentless, unglamorous process discipline.
And this brings us back to that core metaphor. C5 as software, an operating system, OS. And OS handles the basics so the applications can run without crashing the whole machine.
That is the perfect analogy for it. The operating system doesn't solve the user's political problems itself. It establishes the necessary foundational layer. It sets standards, it allocates resources, it manages internal conflicts and access permissions, and most importantly, it allows different applications, or in this case, countries' disparate policies, to run without destabilizing the whole environment.
So the C5's job is not to solve every territorial dispute.
God, no. Its job is to ensure that critical systemic domains like trade, AI, energy, and financial sanctions don't cause a catastrophic system-wide failure when they inevitably collide or conflict.
So if this operating system needs to run continuously and quietly in the background, what does the functional C5 structure actually look like? It clearly has to move beyond ad hoc annual meetings.
It requires a permanent, year-round administrative engine, and the first piece of that is a permanent C5 Secretariat.
Okay, but the risk there is creating another bloated bureaucracy like the UN.
And the sources are adamant about avoiding that. This office cannot be a huge bureaucracy. It must be lean, intensely technical, and limited strictly to coordination logistics, data sharing, and ensuring continuity. It has no enforcement authority.
And leadership.
Leadership should rotate every 2 to 3 years among the 5 members, and it would be staffed by senior seconded officials from their home governments. The Secretariat's primary function is essential continuity. It guarantees the system runs even when there are sudden changes in governments or leadership in one or more of the C5 nations.
And the mechanism for the actual regulatory and technical work, where does that happen?
That is housed in the year-round working groups. This is where the friction is absorbed and channeled. This is the real engine room.
And they meet constantly.
They must meet monthly, not annually. This maintains a continuous technical dialogue. And crucially, they have to have clear authority to escalate issues upward when critical systemic risk thresholds are crossed.
And what are these groups focused on?
The sources mandate at least 5 core groups to manage the key systemic risks. So you have trade and supply chains, which includes digital trade. You have AI and advanced technology safety, energy and climate transition, financial stability and sanctions spillovers, and critically, crisis de-escalation protocols. This structure institutionalizes friction management.
The sources also emphasize that the real silent engine of the C5 is the bureaucracy-to-bureaucracy links.
This is the unglamorous secret to successful coordination. The most important work of the C5 will never, ever make the headlines. It's the trade officials in Washington talking constantly to their counterparts in Beijing. It's AI regulators in Tokyo communicating directly with AI researchers in Bengaluru and Moscow. It's energy planners linking up with grid operators across borders.
Well, it builds trust at the working level.
It builds institutional trust, the kind of trust that survives political cycles and matters far, far more than any personal trust between leaders at a summit. It's the essential lubrication that keeps this very complex machine moving.
So if that permanent engine is running year-round, the role of the annual summit changes completely. It stops being the place where deals are hammered out from scratch.
Exactly. The summit should be the finale, not the main act. The sources are very strict about this. They restrict the leaders' functions to just 3 essential duties.
With it.
First, they ratify agreements that the technical working groups have already negotiated and finalized below them. Second, they resolve the very small handful of highly political, unsettled issues that couldn't be settled at the technical level. And third, they set mandates for the next year's work program, providing political direction.
So the rule is, if the leaders show up and have to negotiate critical items from scratch.
The C5 operating system has already failed. This structure prioritizes speed, operational throughput, and continuity over ceremony and diplomatic latency.
Okay, let's shift focus now to the first critical mandate for the C5, rebooting global trade. We mentioned earlier that the World Trade Organization is considered not just failing, but, in the view of these sources, already failed. I want to dig into their diagnosis of why it failed, which goes beyond just general gridlock.
The diagnosis is indeed severe, but it's also highly specific. They argue the WTO is obsolete because it's frozen in a 1990s worldview that is just profoundly disconnected from the 21st century economy. The core assumptions that underpinned its rules, they simply no longer hold true.
What were those assumptions?
Well, the sources list several. The first big one was that transactions of physical goods were overwhelmingly more important than services or data.
which is obviously no longer true.
Not even close. The second was that tariffs were the primary tool of protectionism, not things like standards or subsidies. Another was that manufacturing value creation was linear and easily trackable. And finally, that supply chains were inherently stable and efficiency was the only goal that mattered.
And every single one of those has been inverted today.
Completely inverted. Today, services and cross-border data flows generate more value than physical goods. Standards, industrial subsidies, and export controls are far more potent policy tools than tariffs ever were. Supply chains are regional, complex, redundant, and deeply politicized.
And the WTO rulebook is just silent on all of this.
It's largely silent. We have no robust global framework for cross-border data flows, for AI services, for carbon border adjustments, for managing these huge industrial policy races, or for dealing with the extensive sanctions spillovers that we see today. The result is a system that's just running on improvisation and fragmentation.
And the ultimate sign of this structural paralysis is the appellate body crisis, which you mentioned briefly before.
Yeah.
Can we elaborate on that? The C5 thesis really rests on the idea that this body is unfixable through universal consensus.
It is the ultimate expression of structural failure. The appellate body was the 7-member panel that heard appeals in trade disputes. It was meant to ensure finality and consistency in WTO law. Since 2019, the United States has unilaterally blocked the appointment of new members.
Why?
They argued the body was routinely overreaching its mandate, functionally creating new law rather than just interpreting existing agreements. But whatever the reason, with insufficient members to hear cases, the system is paralyzed.
So you can file a complaint against a trade violation, you can even win at the first stage. But if the losing country appeals, the case just goes into a legal void because there's no functioning higher court to hear it.
Exactly, it's a dead end. And this paralysis means that WTO rules are now effectively unenforceable if a major power chooses to appeal. This encourages profound fragmentation. Countries are now building parallel trade systems through bilateral deals, regional blocs like the CPTPP or the EU, and they're engaging in aggressive industrial policy arms races because they know the global referee can't blow the whistle.
And fixing it requires consensus from over 160 members.
Which the sources call a veto factory. It's impossible.
So the C5, representing the core of global economic activity, has to step in as a core stabilizer. How does it avoid the WTO's failure mode of consensus paralysis?
By embracing the conceptual shift the sources advocate for, and that is, the future of trade is modular, not universal.
What does that mean, modular?
Instead of forcing one gigantic, unamendable rulebook onto everyone, the C5 would architect a next-generation trade framework built on a series of specialized interoperable modules. Think of it like a tech stack. It's about creating shared minimum standards and compatibility, ensuring different systems can talk to each other, not demanding immediate convergence or identical domestic laws.
Okay, so let's walk through this proposed C5 trade stack. These modules sound like they address the most pressing, unaddressed risks.
They do. The first and maybe most important is the data and digital trade module. Since data, whether it's AI training models, financial records, or cloud services, is the new central trade asset, this module would establish core rules for cross-border data flows.
Things like data localization.
Exactly. It would set limits on data localization requirements and establish privacy interoperability standards. The goal is to prevent digital trade, which is growing exponentially, from fracturing along geopolitical lines based on competing, incompatible national regulations.
Then there is the necessary shift from efficiency to security, which is encapsulated in the supply chain resilience module.
That's right. This is about moving the global focus from minimum cost efficiency to maximum survivability. This module would focus on mandatory transparency standards for key choke points, think rare earth processing or specialized chip manufacturing.
So everyone knows where the vulnerabilities are.
Yes. And it would mandate redundancy requirements for critical goods and coordinate joint risk assessments for shared choke points. This is not about total decoupling. It is managed interdependence, designed to absorb unexpected shocks without crashing the global machine.
Climate policy is now inseparable from trade policy. How does the C5 manage that friction?
Very, very carefully, because carbon has become essentially a new non-tariff barrier. The climate and carbon module would work to standardize carbon accounting methodologies, making sure everyone is measuring greenhouse gas emissions the same way, and it would align border adjustment measures.
So you don't get climate-based trade wars.
The goal is crucial. Preventing climate policy, however well-intentioned, from becoming disguised protectionism that leads to widespread retaliation. If the C5 coordinates this, the rest of the world has a template to follow.
And what about addressing the industrial policy arms race? This fight over subsidies and government support that seems to be escalating everywhere.
That falls under the Industrial Policy Disclosure module. The C5 would have to recognize that industrial policy and subsidies are here to stay. They're not going to be banned. But they can be managed.
How?
This module would introduce disclosure requirements for major subsidies, set agreed-upon thresholds for certain types of market intervention, and establish guardrails to manage these races before they escalate into full-blown trade wars. This is about managing competition, not trying to eliminate it.
And a way to solve disputes quickly.
Finally, yes, there needs to be a dispute fast-track module, a C5-specific technical resolution system that operates in weeks, not years, restoring some level of predictability for trade within these 5 core states.
It's a structure designed for pragmatic speed. It acknowledges that uniformity is impossible, but coordination among the world's functional core is simply non-negotiable for system stability.
It's a reboot for the world as it actually is. The sources emphasize that the real alternative to a C5-led modular architecture isn't the fixed old WTO. It's an acceleration toward pure chaos, where trade disputes escalate into security disputes and the digital economy splinters entirely.
So if trade fragmentation is the major economic risk, the second core mandate for the C5, and perhaps the most urgent one for global security, is AI safety governance. The sources argue this transcends traditional geopolitical competition. It's about managing risks that are inherent in the technology itself.
That framing is absolutely essential. The sources make a very clear distinction. AI is unlike the previous existential threat, which was nuclear weapons.
How's it different?
Nuclear stability was based on a few key things: centralization, immense cost, slow proliferation, and visibility. It was, in a way, a contained threat. Advanced AI is the opposite on every single one of those metrics. It's cheap relative to its impact, it's diffuse, it's incredibly fast-moving, and it's largely invisible.
So it's not just a weapon.
It's not just a weapon, it is a force multiplier for everything, and that includes especially errors and instability.
So the dominant risk is not necessarily intentional warfare, but accidental cascading systemic failure. Is that the fear?
That is the real systemic threat: misalignment and cascade failure. Imagine autonomous systems escalating a conventional conflict faster than human command systems can possibly intervene, or interconnected AI-driven financial models amplifying volatility, leading to an economic collapse at machine speed.
And these scenarios don't require malevolence.
Not at all. They just require speed, scale, and insufficient technical coordination among the global players who train and deploy these models.
And national regulation alone is guaranteed to fail because of global fragmentation.
It's an issue of scale and jurisdiction. I mean, today's governance landscape is a complete patchwork. You've got varying national laws, often voluntary safety standards, and hardware-focused export controls that completely ignore the crucial layer of software behavior.
Which guarantees failure.
It guarantees failure through 3 mechanisms. First, regulatory arbitrage, where the most advanced models just migrate to the least regulated jurisdictions. Second, security races, where safety becomes secondary to the speed of development. And third, an inevitable trust collapse, because no country can trust that its rivals are being careful enough with this potentially world-altering technology.
Does the C5's the only starting point?
It's the only viable starting point because its members host or regulate the vast majority of advanced AI research, the compute power, and the critical semiconductor supply chains.
So the sources propose an incredibly ambitious goal: an AI Geneva Convention. This sounds like applying rules of restraint and transparency to algorithms.
That is the objective. It's about regulating behavior and deployment, not attempting an impossible ban on the technology itself. And the first pillar is fundamental: compute threshold disclosure.
What does that mean?
This would require the C5 members to commit to declaring the training runs of any model above an agreed-upon very high compute limit. They would declare it to a confidential, technical, multilateral body.
But practically, how do you verify that? And what constitutes a high compute limit? I mean, that sounds incredibly technically and politically fraught.
It is intensely difficult, but the sources argue it's essential. Compute is the best proxy we have for potential capabilities. The thresholds would have to be set very high, far, far above what standard enterprise AI uses, to focus only on what are called frontier models.
The ones with the most risk.
The ones with demonstrated potential for dual-use risk or dangerous emergent properties. Verification would have to rely on shared auditing protocols and, critically, mutual vulnerability. If the U.S. declares a trillion-parameter run, China needs to declare theirs too. The goal isn't to stop innovation, it's to prevent strategic surprise. It's about ensuring mutual awareness of major capability breakthroughs that could alter the global strategic balance overnight.
And what about making sure models are tested thoroughly before they're deployed? That sounds like mandatory international safety standards.
It is. The second pillar is mandatory red teaming for frontier models. Models above certain capability levels must undergo rigorous, standardized stress testing conducted by independent, multinational teams before they are deployed in any high-stakes environments.
What are they testing for?
This testing is designed specifically to probe for misuse potential, for emergent autonomy, and for dangerous, unpredictable behaviors. This builds shared security standards, which is a public good, even for rivals.
Then there is the huge question of preserving human control, especially in military and financial contexts.
This is a non-negotiable point in the source material, the principle of human-in-the-loop requirements for lethal and financial systems. The convention must enforce a commitment to meaningful human override, preserving what they call human decision primacy.
What does that mean? Meaningful control.
That's the core technical challenge, defining it across 5 different political systems. But the sources warn that without this guardrail, if we delegate critical, irreversible decisions to machines operating at machine speed, governance itself collapses because human political control is lost.
And finally, you have to manage the inevitable errors and near misses that technology always produces.
That requires an incident reporting and rapid alert channel. It would be a protected, shared mechanism to report AI incidents, near misses, and unexpected autonomous behaviors. This is modeled directly on the global aviation safety system, where transparency about failure is prioritized over finding blame, because learning from mistakes makes the entire system safer for everyone.
And there's one last proposed pillar.
Yes. Establishing a norm against the no first use of autonomous lethal systems. A fundamental commitment to retaining human judgment in life and death decisions.
Okay, so the major challenge, which you have to address, is why on earth the US and China, who are locked in this incredibly tense rivalry, would ever agree to share data or red lines on their most strategic, future-defining technology. Isn't this just hopelessly naive?
The sources argue it is the exact opposite of naive. It is Cold War arms control logic applied to a much faster problem. AI safety doesn't require friendship or trust. It requires verification and mutual vulnerability.
Explain that.
Every single C5 member knows they cannot afford an accidental AI-triggered conflict. They cannot afford a runaway economic collapse caused by rivals or even their own uncontrolled system. This shared existential risk is the necessary foundation for cooperation without trust. The structure must include reciprocal verification and symmetric obligations.
So it's mutually assured destruction, but for the digital age.
In a way, yes. The cost of failing to act now, of losing human primacy to machine speed, is simply too high. And, crucially, it's irreversible once machine autonomy really takes hold.
This entire proposal rests on a recognition of the fundamental shift in U.S. global posture. We touched on the American step back, but the sources frame this as the American dilemma. The cost of being the world's cop versus the cost of having no cop.
And the sources argue that the common narrative of American retreat or decline is really misleading. It's less about a decline in capability and more about simple arithmetic. The cost of global leadership became economically and politically unsustainable.
It just got too expensive.
It got too expensive. The U.S. spent trillions of dollars on wars with ambiguous or even negative outcomes. It maintained endless security commitments across nearly every theater in the world, and it accumulated severe domestic political fatigue as voters began to question the return on that investment.
So the retreat is structural exhaustion, not just an ideological choice by one administration or another.
Exactly. The costs of enforcement rose faster than the tangible benefits of dominance, and that led to domestic neglect and political polarization. Furthermore, the sources detail the severe, often hidden liabilities of being the world's sole policeman.
Such as?
Well, these included overextensions, spreading commitments way too thin. There was moral hazard, where allies took unnecessary risks, knowing the U.S. would ultimately intervene and bail them out. And there was constant blowback, where U.S. enforcement actions bred resentment and opposition abroad, all while the political system at home experienced domestic decay, with voters demanding that resources be allocated domestically rather than externally underwriting global stability.
But the paradox is terrifying. Removing the cop does not lead to peace.
No. It redistributes conflict and it increases volatility. American overreach was destabilizing through intervention and moral hazard, but American absence stepping back without establishing a coherent replacement system is equally, if not more, destabilizing. You see regional conflicts escalating faster. You see countries engaging in rapid rearmament. And you see technical standards fragmenting because there's no anchor to hold them together. The volatility of absence is now the dominant global risk.
And many analysts assume that China is simply waiting in the wings to step into the role of global cop. But the sources? They just shut down that G2 successor theory.
They shut it down based on incentive structure, not on capability. China has the power to influence the system, but it lacks the incentive or the structural legitimacy to run the system.
What's the difference?
System management requires providing global public goods, things like free trade lanes, security guarantees, financial stability. It requires absorbing significant costs for others, and it requires accepting external scrutiny and blame. China excels at using bilateral economic leverage for its own national gain, but historically it avoids the multilateral cost and responsibility that's required for genuine global stewardship.
So a Chinese-led order would have a legitimacy problem.
A massive legitimacy crisis from day one among Europe, India, Japan, and the global south.
So the C5 offers the U.S. a practical path to lead without dominating a way out of this binary choice between unilateral dominance or a chaotic withdrawal.
C5 is framed as burden sharing, not power surrender. It allows the U.S. to continue shaping the global environment, but it fundamentally changes its leadership style. The transition is from command to coordination, enforcement to frameworks, and dominance to stewardship.
The U.S. benefits immensely by remaining the architect of these new rules for AI, for trade, for financial stability, but the costs and the enforcement responsibilities are now distributed among its peers.
Which perfectly aligns with the current American reality of political constraint and voter fatigue. The C5 allows America to stay strategically engaged and shape the future without incurring the impossible exhaustion of being the sole global guarantor. The sources warn that the greatest risk is stepping back without building a replacement system. The goal for the U.S. is to transition its role from the global policeman to the strategic architect.
Okay, so once you accept the need for this C5 operating system, the question of where becomes critically important. The sources dedicate a whole section to this institutional design choice, stressing that the location of the permanent C5 Secretariat becomes the institution's default bias. It affects its legitimacy and its functional focus.
The choice of city, and they debate New York, Shanghai, or Mumbai, is not just a logistical decision. It's a huge political signal and a philosophical statement about where the future center of global gravity lies. It shapes who feels ownership, where the talent is drawn from, and whether the institution focuses on diplomacy, finance, or technology.
So let's start with the traditional default, which would be New York. Why do the sources argue so strongly against setting up the C5 Secretariat anywhere near the UN?
New York is definitively the capital of the old global order, and placing the C5 there risks what the sources call the UN gravity problem.
Explain that.
It embodies the post-1945 power structures, it's saturated with Western institutional norms, and it's known for slow, consensus-driven, and often theatrical bureaucracy. The C5 is meant to be a high-speed, technical replacement layer in areas where the UN system is failing, like trade and AI safety. If it's in New York, it risks being symbolically absorbed into those legacy rituals and confusing its entire mandate.
It also risks being perceived as just an extension of U.S. foreign policy, which would undermine its crucial legitimacy with the other members.
Exactly. It would be perceived as U.S. adjacent and Western coded. That would immediately undermine its legitimacy for India, Russia, and China, the very members whose cooperation is the hardest to secure. C5 requires profound psychological neutrality, which New York simply cannot offer because of its history as the center of U.S. unipolar dominance.
Okay, so that makes the case for Shanghai compelling. It signals that decisive shift to the Indo-Pacific.
Shanghai represents the shift from the Atlantic world to Indo-Pacific gravity. It's a purely economic and technological capital, not a diplomatic museum. It is operational, it's execution-oriented, and it's focused on global trade throughput, which aligns perfectly with the C5's need for coordination, not speeches.
So placing the Secretariat there would signal that the center of global governance has moved.
It signals that it's moved to where the future of manufacturing, supply chains, and data processing is actually being built.
And it avoids that UN trap of excessive politicization.
Absolutely. There's no risk of UN procedural creep, NGO capture, or media-driven theatrics dominating the technical work. The Secretariat could remain technocratic, quiet, and bureaucracy to bureaucracy focused, prioritizing throughput above all else. The objection, of course, is that Shanghai is in China. But the sources argue that while hosting doesn't equal control, Shanghai would at least avoid the perception of a U.S.-dominated order.
But here's where the analysis takes a really surprising turn. The sources argue that Mumbai actually beats Shanghai, despite Shanghai's immense functional strengths. Why is Mumbai the preferred choice for a truly multipolar institution?
The case against Shanghai is subtle, but it's structural. It carries what they call a fatal perception problem. If the C5 sits in Shanghai, the rest of the world reads it as a clear signal. It implies a China-centered future, and it risks reinforcing the very U.S.-China duopoly optics that the C5 is explicitly trying to prevent.
Because the whole point of C5 is that hegemony is over.
Exactly. The future is supposed to be shared stewardship among equals. Mumbai, by contrast, acts as the ultimate structural neutralizer. It is non-China, and it is firmly post-U.S. unipolar.
So Mumbai maximizes political legitimacy by standing outside the gravitational pull of the two largest powers.
Yes, it makes the C5 look like a genuine council of equals, a body of the world that exists beyond camps, and, crucially, the sources present the powerful Africa argument. Geopolitically, the next century will be profoundly shaped by Africa's demographic and economic rise. Mumbai faces the Indian Ocean, which is fast becoming the epicenter of 21st century connective tissue, shipping, and energy flows. This positions Mumbai dramatically better than Shanghai, which faces the more contested Pacific, to serve as the C5's neutral gateway to Africa's rising economies, digital partnerships, and supply chains. It's a foresight argument based on demographics and connectivity.
And functionally, it aligns with the C5's mandates for digital trade and AI governance as well.
Absolutely. India's ecosystem is massive in digital services, software, and talent. For a C5 whose core mandate includes the highly sensitive areas of AI governance and modular digital trade, Mumbai sits at the perfect nexus of finance, tech talent, and the scaling patterns of the global south.
So what's the final verdict from the sources?
They conclude that the functional verdict should be this: the headquarters in Mumbai for neutral, multipolar legitimacy and its unique bridge to the Indian Ocean and Africa, coupled with necessary liaison offices in New York for the UN link and in Shanghai for the link to manufacturing and industrial supply chains.
We've covered everything from the demise of the post-WWII order to modular trade stacks and the urgency of AI safety governance. What are the highest level takeaways for the listener who's trying to grasp the C5 underlying philosophy?
The core principle must be understood clearly. The C5 only works if it embraces interoperability over uniformity and coordination without submission. The members must accept structurally that rivals will run radically different political and economic models. They will interpret sovereignty differently.
In trying to enforce ideological uniformity.
Guarantees the exact paralysis and failure that we see today in the WTO and the UN.
So the goal is to manage the conflicts that arise from the structural reality, not to try and eliminate them.
Exactly. The world is defined not by a converging ideology, but by the distribution of power, which is inherently multipolar. The C5 is merely a mechanism to give stable, functional structure to this reality, and the contrast between the failure modes is crucial. Political camps create wars by hardening ideological identities and demanding loyalty, while functional systems absorb friction and channel conflict, preventing catastrophic system failure.
And the most revolutionary idea here is perhaps the most mundane one of all.
That's the final insight from the sources. They conclude that in a world that's running on outdated, broken systems and is overwhelmed by ideological posturing, functionality may be the most revolutionary thing of all. The C5 is not proposed to be dramatic or ideological or utopian. It is merely proposed to be functional. It's a necessary commitment to process discipline to replace diplomatic spectacle.
That brings us to our final thought for you, the listener. We've seen that the U.S. is facing a structural dilemma, that it's being forced to move from global policeman to system architect. But leadership is expensive, and stepping back without a replacement system is the greatest global risk. The ultimate question for you to consider is this: what systemic risks, trade fragmentation, unchecked AI, crisis escalation protocols are now just too large for ad hoc, low-frequency summits to manage? And how much process discipline, how much institutional boredom, and how much shared, continuous stewardship are the world's most powerful nations actually willing to adopt to prevent a catastrophic global failure?
And if we look specifically at the most urgent threat we discussed today, which is AI safety, the question is not about the machine's intelligence, but about human wisdom in delegation. Once human primacy in decision-making is lost to the speed and scale of machine automation, if we allow autonomous systems to dictate military or financial outcomes simply because they are faster, can that fundamental human agency ever be easily reclaimed? That is the urgency that this C5 proposal attempts to address now before it's too late.
A strategic compass, not a throne. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the structure of the next global age. We'll see you next time.